Okay, so to open the Polysix, it's really easy. There's just 4 screws on the front panel, here on either side. And then there's 4 screws along the back edge. You can actually see their mounting holes from the inside right here. And they hold the back of the top panel to the underside of the synthesizer. And today we're going to replace the original rechargeable battery in this KORG Polysix. We've already removed it here, but we'll show you how to put the new one in addition to not installing a rechargeable battery. There are some steps to do to add a socket and start using a CR2032 or a coin cell battery in here that you need to do. You can't just install that battery because it's not a rechargeable battery, and there's a circuit in here designed to recharge the original battery, so if that circuit's still intact while you put the non-rechargeable battery in, the synth will attempt to charge it when it's powered on, and you certainly want to avoid that. So to remove this CPU board right here, it's really easy. You don't even have to remove the key bed. We just have here for video purposes. There are simply 4 screws, one here, 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 and here, and you can slide this board out. You need to remove the connectors first, and sometimes they can be difficult because they have this blue glue on them. So if you see this kind of blue hardened liquid on there, don't worry about it, it's not important. You'll need to break that seal off, and it sometimes can be very difficult because that glue is strong. But at very worst, wiggle it back and forth or try and get a sharp edge down in there to break those connections, but then you'll simply remove all of these connectors once you've gotten the glue connection broken. And the board will simply slide out from its little holder there, and now we can work on it. Okay, so the original battery sat right here, 3-prong affair, and we are going to need to remove a couple components, including this capacitor and this resistor here, and we're going to need to install a diode in order to block the synth from attempting to charge a non-rechargeable battery. And this CPU board is actually in fantastic shape. There's only extremely minor acid damage on the board, and it's right here in these traces. You'll see some kind of black cloudiness to a trace. Sometimes it's much worse, and you'll see all of the major traces in the area covered in black cloudiness. We'll show you how to repair them on a small scale, and then show you how to install a new battery. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, the rechargeable battery in the KORG Polysix, Poly61, along with synths like the Kawai SX210, SX240, they came from the manufacturer with a rechargeable battery, which is prone to leakage once the battery loses charge, and it happens in almost all of these synthesizers. So we're going to be cleaning up this area. I'm going to repair some traces over here. This board is actually in really good shape. This is very minor damage from the leakage from that battery, but I'm going to go ahead and remove this chip here to get underneath it and get these traces cleaned up, and then we'll install the new non-rechargeable battery in its holder. We'll clean the area really well. And again, this board is really not in bad shape at all, but you're looking for dark patches along the traces like you can see right here, right here. There's also one up there. And there's also a little bit over here. Some circuit boards with significant battery acid damage will have serious traces. Oh, there's also some traces used up here as well. So we're going to scrape these traces back and get them cleaned up and make sure that we restore continuity and that there isn't any potential for further degradation in the future. I want to make sure that we have enough access to scrape back as many bad areas as we can, and we're going to need to remove both this capacitor right here, C40, and this resistor right here, which is resistor number 91, as part of the installation of a non-rechargeable battery. They can just be thrown out, so I'm going to go ahead and remove those now. So I just applied some flux to the underside of both that resistor and that small capacitor, and I'm going to just use some solder wick here, or solder braid, to remove the solder from the underside. Okay, so I've removed that IC number 31, along with the capacitor number 40 and resistor number 91 that we need to remove over here, and I'm just going to clean the board up a little bit better before we start scraping the damaged traces. So again, this board only has really minor damage, and you can always just simply check continuity to make sure that the trace is still functional, but we're already in here, we have the board out. I might as well scrape these back and get them really cleaned up and repair them so that there isn't any potential for further corrosion. So there's some issues in this area right here. There was some issues in here as well, and then we've got a little bit of black cloudiness over here as well, and you'll know, when you scrape this back, the cloudy areas will scrape back far easier than an undamaged trace normally would. So there's a little bit in here, and if I just give it a light scrape, the scalpel in here, it's just kind of cracking away those cloudy areas are. And soon enough, we're seeing the copper underneath. So I would imagine that these traces right here were still fully functional, but again, we're already in here with the board out. So I'm going to clean them up a little bit more and repair the trace and then protect it so that there's no possibility for further damage or any lingering corrosion to cause more damage years from now. Okay, so we've got some clean copper over there. I'm going to do the same thing over here on these guys. This area right here around this IC31 is very common to have damage from the leakage coming from that battery. So you just want to scrape the top layer off of the trace until you get to real nice clean bare metal. And a standard scalpel should do this just fine. And then I like to come back with a fiberglass brush to get it even smoother, because we're gonna lay some solder over this. But again, you'll notice how I just barely chip away at that. You'll see it starts to flake away in those areas where it's all black and cloudy. For the next step, I'm just going to use this fiberglass brush. I bought this set off of eBay or Amazon, and it includes coarse down to more fine type of scratch brushes. Fiberglass is definitely the most common you would use on a circuit board, but sometimes I'll use the brass as well if I need something a little bit more beefy. But once you've scratched away the top of the coating and scratched away any corrosion, you can see we have some pretty nice looking bare metal, clear bare copper here. But in order to get solder to fuse to it, to solder to it well, you really need to have all of that, any layers on top of that bare metal to be gone. And even though it looks like it, oftentimes they're not completely polished. So I'll come in here with a fiberglass brush, and you can see immediately that it's cleaning up that surface above the trace even further than I was able to do with the scalpel. So you're just going to want to do this until they get really nice and shiny, and until you're sure you've removed any of that conformal coating or corrosion from off of these traces here, because we're going to put a layer of solder over them just to make sure that they're nice and sturdy. And if there was a break, in one of these, if it was bad corrosion, you would simply want to use a tiny piece of wire or a bus bar and scrape back to nice clean metal on either side of the break, and then solder that tiny piece of wire over the break to the good pieces of copper on either side of the trace breaks. On this, none of the breaks look very big or serious. We're just cleaning this up, but it's very common on these to need to actually repair a broken trace that's no longer making a connection to the other side or has lost continuity. Okay, so as you can see, we've cleaned up all these traces here really well, and you can see nice, clean, shiny copper. We do have a little bit of damage here in that the negative pin here for our battery is missing. The pad for the pin is missing, so we're going to have to basically rebuild that, because if we just stuck the battery back in here, you can see it's not connected to the ground that surrounds the circuit board here, and it needs to be connected to that. So I've just taken a little piece of wire and bent it into a little eyelet like you can see here, and we're going to need to use this and solder it into position here so that our battery holder makes nice connection to the negative side of the circuit board when we get to that point. Okay, so we need to tin all of these areas of the traces that we've cleaned up here just to add a little bit more thickness to them, and then I'll put some conformal coating over them. And again, if there was a break in one of these or a missing pad like you can see here, you're going to need to tin the trace regardless in order to be able to solder any additional wire to it. So I've cleaned it up really well, and then with the fiberglass brush and a scalpel, and then I cleaned it up with alcohol and a foam swab, and now I'm just going to run some flux, just a little bit of flux along the area here. You can never use too much of it. This area here is already tinned, but we're going to do a little bit more on that. You can see that there were a little bit of corrosion on lots of different traces, and this is very common with these KORGs, the Polysix and Poly 61, and it's not uncommon for there to be damage in a radius that's kind of like this whole area right here. It's very common for this resistor array here to be completely eaten through. Again, this is probably, I would rate this a 9 out of 10 condition-wise, whereas most of these are a 4 or 5 due to the battery acid damage being so common. So to tin, it's really easy. All you need to do, like I said, is get some flux down and bring your solder over to your iron and just rub the solder around in the area, and you'll see, as long as you've cleaned all the coating off of the trace, it will create this very nice, shiny, even layer of solder on top of it. And so if we've done that well here, it should be the same thing. See that? Again, just lightly run your iron with a little bit of solder on the edge over these. And again, to repair a trace, you've got to do this first if there's any major breaks, because in order for a little piece of wire to easily be able to solder to that copper trace, it has to be tinned first. And I like to do it again just to add a little bit of thickness and protection, even if the traces aren't completely eaten through in a particular area. Just to put some on there. Oh, right in here. I need to... Okay, so I'm just going to take this little eyelet that I made out of a piece of wire and place it on top of my tin trace where the pad is missing. And you want the ends of it to extend down in so you can get a nice thick layer of solder over that. And you're going to need to hold it down with some tweezers. So I have plenty of flux down there, so I'm just going to add some solder to the end of my iron, which you usually would not do, but I need it to be there, and I don't have 3 hands. And now I'm going to hold this down here and get these to come together. Check my positioning, which is a little off, but now that it's soldered there, I can use my tweezers to bend the wire loop just a little bit. There we go. Get it in really nice shape here as far as its position. Excuse my arm. You want to just try and make it the same sort of size as the original hole there. Oopsie. It's not wanting to move there, but I think that's pretty close. That should work. So I'm just going to add a little bit more solder to this. Again, you have to hold it down, because if I just brought my iron over, we would move the eyelet. So I just like to put my solder kind of in place ahead of time. And now we have a nice, big, strong bond there holding that eyelet in place, so that when we do put our holder in there, it will slide nicely in there and make connection with that. Okay, so this isn't absolutely necessary, but we want to clean up the area, and then I'm going to put some conformal coating over the areas that we've repaired. It's basically like solder mask. If you don't have any, it's not absolutely critical, but it is just another thing to protect the traces that you've repaired and the surrounding areas, and make them non-conductive if anything were to touch. You just want to be careful where you apply it. Right now I'm just cleaning with rubbing alcohol to make sure we have a really nice clean surface, and then I have some conformal coating in here, and I'll take a little foam swab, soak the end of it, and I'm just going to paint over the back side of the edges that I've gone and cleaned up. You don't want to do the holes themselves because you need those to still make contact. The through holes, that is. And this stuff dries really fast. Again, just adds that another protective layer. I'll do these underneath the IC, but again, just the traces themselves, not the through holes. Okay, so now that conformal coating is dried, and we need to add this diode where this resistor number R91 was previously, because this capacitor here and this resistor here were part of the circuit that recharged the original rechargeable battery. But since we're putting in a coin cell holder with a non-rechargeable battery, we got to make sure that this circuit isn't trying to charge a non-rechargeable battery, because that's obviously not good either. So we're going to put this diode in the place of this resistor to block that voltage, and the banded side of a diode is the cathode, and that needs to point towards the capacitor in this case. So I'm just going to bend the legs ahead of time, and then we're going to slide the diode into the location of R number 91, again with the cathode, the banded side, pointing towards the capacitor. And we're going to slide this all the way down. Try to make it even here. This is just a standard N4148 diode that can be used here, very common, cheap, buy them on Amazon. Okay, so that's now in place, so we're going to solder that. Go ahead and hold it down and bend the legs out so it holds it in place there. And I'm going to get some flux back over here. It looks like there's still some left, but we'll add a tiny bit more. And then get my solder. Again, you always want to touch the lead you're trying to solder and not directly to, don't put the solder directly on the iron unless it's unavoidable, and that's good to go now. So I'll bring in my snips or my flush cutters and snip away the old leads here, and obviously remove them. You don't want to let those accidentally get left behind in the synth, because they could end up shorting something out later down the line. So now that's in, we can just leave the capacitor area empty, and we are now going to install our battery holder, but first I'm going to reinstall the IC that I removed to get underneath it. Okay, so I'm going to put this chip back in. This is just a logic chip, and you just need to make sure that the indentation on the chip lines up with the one on the circuit board. This little dot right here denotes pin 1, and pin 1 is always the first pin on the left of that notch. So we're going to go ahead and slide this into position here. You could add a socket here if you wanted to. Just make sure it's placed down there firmly. And we did check this chip to make sure that it is functioning as well. So now I'm going to go ahead and add some flux to this area again, and just come in and quickly solder these pads. Work from left to right if you're right-handed. Now we've reinstalled this IC here, number 31, and we put our diode in with the cathode facing towards the capacitor that we've removed as well. And we're going to install this little coin cell holder so that it's really easy to replace the battery in the future. And these are pretty simple. The top bar here is the positive side, and you can see it has a little positive mark right there, and that pin comes down right here. And it doesn't match up perfectly in size with the original pinholes, and you can see that on the original the battery had 3 pins total, 2 on the positive side and then 1 on the negative side. And you don't need to use both of them, they are connected together. You can just fill one of them with solder that you don't end up using, and it's not going to be a big deal. But as you can see here, and this is the case in almost every synthesizer when you try to install a battery holder, the pins don't match up as far as their position. So we're going to need to bend these pins to fit. And that is just a trial and error process. Get yourself a nice pair of needle nose pliers like this and just start small, bend them each a little bit. I try to make the bends symmetrical on either pin. And then we'll take another look here. We're much closer there. Actually, it's pretty darn close. It's not probably going to sit flush all the way down, and there's these little nubs on the bottom and make sure that it doesn't hit the circuit board and short anything out there. But it looks like I've got these lined up pretty good. So I'm just going to go ahead and place that in the hole. And you'll see this IC is going to prevent this from going down as far as it should, but that's not a problem either. So it can just sit kind of like that. Again, just make sure there's nothing being shorted. And make sure that the pins at least come down and go through the holes on the bottom. You see it popped out right there. So it's good to have a piece of tape nearby, just because we're going to want to hold this down. You don't want it to pop out when you're trying to solder it, because then you're going to have to go back and redo it. All right, so I've got that coin cell holder taped down, and I'm just going to solder this first pin on this side first. That's looking good. So now I'm just going to go and flip this back over and take a look at it again to make sure that it's pressed down as far as I can get it. Yep, that's looking pretty good there. Okay. So you can see that pin sticking out there, and then this is the other side here. I'll just fill this other side with solder. Not absolutely necessary, but I do it anyways. And now I'll solder this other pin in over here. Nice clean joint there using flux. And now I can remove the tape. And we've got our coin cell holder now installed. Okay, so now I'm just going to clean up the flux on the bottom. This is just 99% rubbing alcohol. Foam swabs are so much better than Q-tips. Obviously you can use Q-tips in a pinch, but they leave little fibers everywhere, and foam swabs are cheap. You can buy them from any electrical supply or even Amazon. I have them in several different shapes and sizes, and they're much nicer to get in, and they hold together much nicer than a typical Q-tip will. And they don't leave the residue. Now that's done, and I've just cleaned the top side with alcohol as well. I'm just going to go ahead and install our coin cell here. Okay, so that should be making a connection now, but we should test that. And you could simply use a meter like this, a multimeter, and I'm going to flip it over and probe the circuits on the underside to make sure that they're making a connection to that battery. And our positive side was these two joints right here, and they're connected, so I'm just going to touch this joint over here, and then touch the ground, and there it is, almost 3.4 volts, which is quite good. And you can also test this pin here on the battery, which is again the negative, but that's directly connected to the holder itself. And if I want to make sure that there's a solid connection, I'll just touch the regular ground. And usually when you see a big ring of trace around the edge of a circuit board, it's almost always going to be part of the ground circuit. So this looks good. Okay, so we're going to put the board back in now in its original position. Not going to screw it in yet because we want to test the synthesizer. Pull the connectors out of the way, and there's one other thing we need to solder back. Any and all Polysixes, or all the ones I've seen at least, have this ground cable soldered from the middle potentiometer board to the ground circuit on the CPU board right here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that as well. Put a flux on there, and I'll get my iron and get this all liquefied here. Good. I'll get my wire back on that and make sure it's nice and covered. But that's it, and we are good to go now. Check all of our pins. Oftentimes on Polysix and 61, these pins are a huge source of problems. These ones look great, but often they are very blue and corroded. And if that is the case, you're going to need to probably replace the pins or pull them out at the very least and clean them up. But looking at this one, they all look excellent actually. And KORG was nice enough to label connectors for you. So you can see on the front of this one, for example, it says 06. And if we look at the board, there's a label right there that says CN06 for connector 6. Most synths are not labeled that well. KORG was nice, so you don't have to mark the connectors themselves. Let's see, this one says 11, and sure enough, it says 11 right there. But if there's a synth that doesn't have those labels, you can always mark with a pen like I have on this one, where you can slide it in. You'll see my marks match up with the connector, so you know that you put it back in the right place. Do this one as well. So now the synth is all connected back up. This one we're missing right here is just for the key bed, which we will put back in a second so that we can test the synthesizer. But this is how it should look for now. Okay, so we've got our battery put in, and we've removed the necessary components and also added that diode. So we've got it all connected back up, so I'm going to close it up here and let's see how it sounds. Thanks for joining us today with the KORG Polysix. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. Let us know if you'd like to see more repair videos like this one or synth demos.